Black CIA agent mistakenly harassed by cop during routine grocery run, and this happened. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. The steady rhythm of rain tapped softly against the windows of the car, a soundtrack to the quiet darkness of the night. Marcus Davis sat behind the wheel, his face calm and composed, yet there was an underlying tension in the air. He had no way of knowing that what should have been a simple late-night grocery run would soon unravel into a life-altering event. The flickering streetlights of Branton City illuminated his path, but those lights were only a prelude to the confrontation that awaited him. At 36, Marcus had built a life he could be proud of. Standing at nearly 6 feet tall with smooth brown skin and intelligent eyes, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth but saw no need to boast about it. A cybersecurity specialist for a government agency, his sharp mind had earned him a reputation for solving complex problems with an ease that others found admirable. But for Marcus, work was just one facet of his life. His true pride and joy were his family, his wife, Jenna, and their 6-year-old daughter, Aria. Raised in a modest household in Chicago, Marcus had learned from an early age the value of education, integrity, and perseverance. His parents, both educators, had instilled in him the importance of hard work and self-respect. That foundation had carried him through college, where he met Jenna, the love of his life. Together, they had built a home full of love and laughter, with Aria being the center of their world. Despite the demands of his career, Marcus always made time for his family, cherishing the moments he spent with them. Tonight, however, was different. The familiar hum of the grocery store late at night was a rare comfort for Marcus. It was a brief escape from the pressures of his job and the challenges of being a black man in America. As he moved through the brightly lit aisles, gathering items for breakfast the next morning, he felt a sense of peace. The store was quiet, with only a few other late-night shoppers browsing the shelves. The fluorescent lights reflected off his glasses, making him appear more serious than he felt. Unbeknownst to Marcus, Officer Ryan Miller had just entered the store. A 42-year-old white police officer with over 2 decades of service under his belt, Miller had seen it all. The years had made him jaded, his instincts sharpened by countless encounters with crime and violence. His gut reaction had saved him on more than one occasion, but it had also begun to cloud his judgment. He had become suspicious of nearly everything and everyone. Miller's eyes scanned the aisles as he casually strolled through the store, his mind always on the lookout for trouble. He noticed Marcus almost immediately. Something about him, the late hour, the hood of his sweatshirt pulled up to shield himself from the rain, seemed off. There had been a string of robberies in the area recently, and Miller's instincts, fueled by years of experience and unconscious bias, told him that Marcus didn't belong there. As Marcus placed his groceries on the conveyor belt, completely unaware of Miller's scrutiny, the officer watched from a distance, his hand hovering near his radio. There was no real reason to be suspicious of Marcus, but Miller's gut told him otherwise. His suspicion grew with every passing second, and he silently followed Marcus out of the store. The parking lot outside was dimly lit by a few flickering streetlights, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. The rain had picked up, and the sound of water splashing into puddles filled the air. Marcus walked toward his car, his mind still on the mundane task of getting home to Jenna and Aria, when a voice called out behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus stopped in his tracks and turned around. Standing a few feet away was Officer Miller, his hand resting on his holstered gun. Marcus's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his face calm, his hands visible. "Can I help you, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, though his pulse had quickened. "Mind if I see some ID?" Miller's tone carried an underlying assumption of guilt. The words weighed down by years of hardened suspicion. Marcus frowned, his body tensed slightly. "Is there a problem?" "Just a routine check," Miller replied, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at Marcus's hoodie. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area." Marcus's mind raced. He had seen this kind of thing before, both in the news and through personal stories shared by friends. Racial profiling wasn't new to him, but it was always jarring when it happened. He was a government agent, a man who had built a life of respect and integrity. Surely this would clear up once Miller knew who he was. Keeping his composure, Marcus reached into his pocket and handed over his ID. "Here you go," he said, his voice calmly. Miller took the ID and glanced at it, his eyes flicking between the name on the card and Marcus's face. He didn't recognize the name, didn't care about the details. All he saw was a black man out late at night in a neighborhood that wasn't his. "Step over here for a moment," Miller ordered, gesturing toward the hood of the police car. Marcus's frustration started to rise, but he complied, walking toward the police vehicle. The rain soaked through his clothes as Miller patted him down, searching for any excuse to escalate the situation. When he found nothing, Miller moved on to search for the car, rifling through the back seat while Marcus stood in the rain, his fists clenched at his sides. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Marcus said, his voice firm but controlled. "I haven't done anything wrong." Miller ignored him, his own frustration growing. He couldn't find anything to justify his suspicion, yet something about Marcus's calm demeanor irked him. It was as if Marcus knew he was above the situation, and that only fueled Miller's need to assert his authority. After what felt like hours, Miller finally stopped. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and both men were soaked to the bone. Miller handed Marcus his ID back, but his pride wouldn't allow him to apologize. "You're free to go," he said, his tone still laced with suspicion. Marcus took his ID, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear but from the anger boiling inside him. He had never felt so humiliated, so powerless. He was a government agent, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting his country, yet here he was, treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. Without a word, Marcus turned and walked away, his mind spinning with thoughts of what had just transpired. This wasn't over, not for him. The sound of the rain had faded into the background by the time Marcus got home, but the weight of what had happened at the grocery store pressed heavily on him. As he walked through the front door, the familiar warmth of home greeted him, but it did little to lift the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You're home late," Jenna called from the kitchen, her voice laced with mild concern. She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her brown eyes softening as they landed on Marcus. "Everything okay?" For a moment, Marcus considered brushing it off, telling her that everything was fine, but the frustration in his chest refused to stay silent. He set the groceries on the counter and leaned against it, his hands gripping the edge. "I was stopped by the police," Marcus said quietly, his voice controlled but heavy with emotion. Jenna's face immediately tightened with worry. Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Routine check," they said. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just leaving the store, and this cop, he assumed the worst because of how I looked." Jenna shook her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "Because you're a black man out late at night in a hoodie? It's ridiculous, Marcus. You didn't deserve that." "I know," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "But it's not just me, Jenna. It's every black man. We can be lawyers, doctors, government agents. It doesn't matter. The moment we're seen as suspicious, we're stripped of who we are, of what we've worked for." Jenna stepped closer, placing her hand gently on his arm. "I'm sorry that happened to you. It's not fair." "It's never fair," Marcus replied, his tone quieter now, but the anger still lingered. He looked down at her hand on his arm, grateful for her support, but feeling powerless all the same. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, Jenna already asleep beside him, the events of the evening played on a loop in his mind. He thought about the officer's face, the look in his eyes that said he didn't care who Marcus was, only that he didn't belong. No matter how far Marcus had come in life, no matter what he had achieved, it didn't seem to matter. Sleep eluded him, and when the first light of dawn broke through the window, Marcus was still awake, his mind now swirling with the question of what to do next. He didn't want to be another statistic, another nameless victim of racial profiling. He wanted to fight back, to make sure this wouldn't happen to someone else. But how? The video hit social media by mid-morning, and by noon it had gone viral. "Man harassed by police during routine grocery run," the headline on the post read. A passerby had filmed the entire encounter between Marcus and Officer Miller, capturing the tense exchange, the pat-down, the car search, and the officer's condescending tone. It was all there for the world to see. Marcus had barely finished his first cup of coffee when his phone started buzzing with notifications, texts from friends, emails from colleagues, social media mentions from strangers. Jenna, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, looked up from her phone, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock. "Marcus, have you seen this?" she asked, her voice tinged with both worry and disbelief. He took her phone from her hand, his eyes scanning the video that was now spreading like wildfire across the internet. His stomach tightened. It was one thing to experience humiliation firsthand, but seeing it broadcast to the world brought a fresh wave of discomfort. By noon, news outlets were picking up the story, and Marcus's name and face were splashed across the headlines. The narrative quickly evolved, not just a black man wrongfully profiled, but a black man who worked for the government as a cybersecurity expert, no less, being treated like a common criminal. The irony was too rich for the media to ignore. As the day went on, the phone calls began. Reporters, activists, friends, and family all wanted to talk to Marcus. They wanted him to share his side of the story, to speak out about what had happened. They wanted him to become the face of a movement, but Marcus wasn't sure if he was ready for that. By evening, the pressure to respond was overwhelming. As Marcus sat in the living room with Jenna, Arya playing quietly on the floor with her toys, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at stake. "You have to say something," Jenna urged, her voice firm but gentle. "People are looking to you now. This isn't just about you anymore." Marcus sighed, his head resting in his hands. "I know, Jenna, but it's not that simple. Once I speak out, once I step into the spotlight, there's no going back. What if it gets worse? What if we become targets?" "We already are," Jenna said softly. "You've always known that, but now you have the chance to do something about it. You can't just let this go." She was right, of course. Marcus had seen too many stories like his, stories of black men and women targeted because of the color of their skin. He had always felt injustice, but now he was living it. And he knew that staying silent would only allow the problem to persist. Later that night, after putting Arya to bed, Marcus sat down at his computer and opened his email. The subject lines were a blur of media requests and messages of support. He took a deep breath and began typing a response to one of the major news outlets that had reached out earlier in the day. "I'm ready to talk," he wrote. The next morning, Marcus found himself in front of a camera, sitting across from a well-known news anchor in a downtown studio. The lights were bright and the cameras were rolling, but Marcus's focus was sharp. He had made the decision to speak out, and now there was no turning back. "Mr. Davis, your story has resonated with so many people," the anchor began. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that night?" Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes steady on the anchors. "What happened that night is what happens to so many black men in this country. I was stopped, searched, and treated like a criminal simply because of the color of my skin. It didn't matter that I hadn't done anything wrong. It didn't matter that I work for the government, that I've spent my life serving this country. All that mattered was that I fit the profile of what this officer thought was suspicious." The anchor nodded, leaning forward slightly. "And how did it feel, knowing that this encounter was filmed and shared with the world?" Marcus hesitated, his mind briefly flashing back to the moment in the parking lot. "It's humiliating," he admitted. "It's one thing to experience it in private, but to have the entire world witness it, that's something else entirely. But at the same time, I'm grateful that the video exists. Without it, this would have been just another incident that gets swept under the rug. The video gives us a chance to expose the reality of what's happening." The interview continued, with Marcus speaking openly about the experience, the anger, and the sense of powerlessness that came with it. But he also spoke about the bigger picture, the systemic issue of racial profiling, the need for reform, and the hope that his story could spark meaningful change. As Marcus's media appearances continued, the momentum of his story grew. Headlines shifted from recounting the events of the grocery store to larger conversations about systemic racism and racial profiling in law enforcement. It wasn't just local news anymore. National outlets were picking up the story, and Marcus Davis was quickly becoming a recognizable face. But with that recognition came pressure. Every time Marcus sat down for an interview, or attended a rally, or spoke at a community event, the weight of the expectations mounted. People expected him to be a voice for justice, a leader for change. Yet Marcus knew that his story was just one among many, and he feared the consequences of becoming a symbol for something so much bigger than himself. The morning after his third major television interview, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with Jenna, sipping his coffee as Arya played in the living room. The house was quiet, but Marcus's mind was anything but. He had a rally to attend later that day, and he knew the crowds would be even larger than the last one. "You're doing the right thing," Jenna said, sensing his unease as she sat down across from him. "I know," Marcus replied, setting down his coffee, "but it's starting to feel overwhelming. This is bigger than me now." Jenna reached for his hand. "It is bigger than you, but that's why it's so important. You've been given a platform that can actually make a difference." Marcus nodded, though the weight of that truth pressed down on him. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. It was his publicist, a woman named Elena Taylor, who had been handling the flood of interview requests and media appearances since the story broke. "Marcus, we need to talk," Elena said as soon as he answered. Her voice was tense, lacking the usual calm professionalism. "There's been some backlash, social media mostly. People are questioning your story, whether it's been exaggerated, whether you were really targeted because of your race. Some are even saying the video doesn't show the whole picture." Marcus closed his eyes, a mix of frustration and disbelief coursing through him. "What are you talking about? The video is clear. It shows exactly what happened." "I know," Elena said quickly. "But you know how it is. People will twist anything to fit their narrative. Some are accusing you of using your government position to manipulate the situation, to make it seem worse than it really was." Marcus felt the anger rise in his chest. "So now I'm the one on trial?" "Not officially," Elena said, her tone softening. "But it's out there. And the police union has started speaking out in defense of Officer Miller. They're saying he was just doing his job, that he had no way of knowing who you were." Marcus shook his head, his frustration spilling over. "That's the whole point. He shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with respect." "I agree with you," Elena said. "But this is going to get messy. I just wanted to give you a heads up. We need to stay ahead of this." Marcus hung up the phone, his mood darkening. Jenna watched him carefully. "What is it?" "They're turning this into a debate about me," Marcus said, his voice low with frustration. "I'm the problem, not the system that let this happen." Jenna squeezed his hand. "We knew this wasn't going to be easy, but you're not alone in this. People see what's happening. They see the truth." Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Miller sat at his desk, the weight of the investigation pressing down on him like a physical force. Since the video had gone viral, his life had become a living nightmare. He had been placed on administrative leave while the internal investigation played out, and the media had painted him as the villain in this story. At first, Miller had felt defensive, convinced that he had just been doing his job. After all, there had been robberies in the area, and Marcus had looked suspicious. At least, that's what he had told himself. But the more he watched the video, the more doubt crept in. He had seen the footage over and over again. The way he had followed Marcus out of the store. The way he had patted him down without cause. The way he had rifled through the man's car, looking for anything to justify his suspicion. But there was nothing. And yet, the moment he had seen Marcus, something inside him had triggered. It wasn't conscious, but it was there. The assumption. The bias. Miller had spent his entire career priding himself on being a good cop. He had seen the worst of humanity, dealt with violent criminals, drug dealers, and thieves. His instincts had kept him alive in dangerous situations more times than he could count. But now he realized those instincts had also betrayed him. This time he hadn't been protecting anyone. He had been profiling. Miller leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of his small, cluttered office. The investigation was ongoing, and his superiors had assured him that they would support him, that they believed he had acted in good faith. But deep down, Miller knew the truth. He had made a mistake, a big one. And it wasn't just a mistake, it was a symptom of something much larger. As the days passed, the pressure on the Branton City Police Department mounted. The community was in an uproar, and public officials were scrambling to contain the situation. In an effort to address the growing tension, the mayor organized a public forum, a chance for the police department to engage with the community and discuss the issues of racial bias and profiling. The forum was held in a large auditorium at the Branton City Community Center, and by the time Marcus arrived, the place was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the seats, and a palpable sense of anger and frustration hung in the air. Marcus took a deep breath as he stood at the edge of the crowd, Jenna by his side. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the weight of their expectations pressing down like a heavy cloak. This was his chance, his moment to speak truth to power. When it was his turn to take the stage, Marcus walked slowly to the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see Officer Miller sitting in the front row, flanked by police officials and city leaders. Miller's face was unreadable, but Marcus could sense the tension radiating from him. "Thank you for being here tonight," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What happened to me that night, what you all saw in that video, is something that happens to Black men and women across this country every single day. We are seen as threats, as criminals, simply because of the color of our skin. It doesn't matter what we've achieved, what we've built, or who we are. All that matters is the assumption." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I'm not here to vilify the police," Marcus continued. "I know there are good officers out there, officers who do their jobs with integrity and respect. But there is a problem in this system, and it's a problem that we can no longer ignore. Racial profiling is real, and it's destroying lives. It almost destroyed mine." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, before landing on Officer Miller. "But it doesn't have to be this way. We can fix this. We can change the system. But it starts with acknowledging the problem, and it starts with all of us, especially those in power, taking responsibility for our actions." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding with both adrenaline and relief. He had said what needed to be said. Now it was up to the city, up to the country, to take the next steps. As he left the stage, Marcus locked eyes with Officer Miller, who nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that had been spoken. For the first time, Officer Miller felt the full weight of his guilt. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, but now he saw the truth. He had been part of the problem. The racial bias that had driven his actions that night wasn't just an individual failing, it was systemic. It was ingrained in the very fabric of the law enforcement culture he had been a part of for over 2 decades. As he left the forum that night, Miller knew what he had to do. He couldn't change the past, but he could start by admitting the truth, to himself, to Marcus, and to the world. The days following the public forum were a whirlwind of activity and emotion for Marcus. The city buzzed with conversations about racial profiling and police reform. News outlets continued to cover his story, and social media was flooded with posts supporting Marcus and demanding change. Despite the overwhelming backing, the backlash was palpable. While many rallied behind him, others viewed Marcus as a threat to law enforcement. He received anonymous messages, some filled with hateful rhetoric, others subtly threatening. "You're stirring up trouble," one read. "Stay in your lane." Marcus tried to brush them off, but each message chipped away at his resolve. He had chosen to speak out, but the toll it was taking on him and his family was becoming increasingly evident. At home, Jenna noticed the change in him. Marcus often seemed lost in thought, a distant look in his eyes. During dinner, he would stare at his plate, barely eating, and when Aria tugged at his arm to share her "Are you okay?" Jenna asked one night, her voice soft but filled with "I'm fine," Marcus replied, though he knew he was anything but Marcus, yo. He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "It's just, I never expected this. I thought speaking out would help, but it feels like it's making everything worse. I'm scared, Jenna. Scared for you, for Aria, for what's coming next." Jenna reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You're doing the right thing. Change doesn't come easy, but it's necessary. We're in this together, no matter what." As much as Marcus appreciated her support, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one in the spotlight, vulnerable and exposed. A week later, Marcus stood in front of a crowd at a rally organized to support his cause. The energy in the air was electric, with chants of "Justice for Marcus" ringing out. People of all backgrounds had gathered, united in their demand for change. As he took the stage, Marcus felt the weight of their expectations. He looked out over the sea of faces, hopeful, determined, and passionate. But just as quickly as that energy surged, a wave of doubt washed over him. What if he failed them? What if his story became just another fleeting headline? "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his voice strong yet laced with vulnerability. "This isn't just about me. It's about every single person who has been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. It's about a system that has failed too many of us for too long." The crowd erupted in applause, fueling his courage. But beneath the surface, the anxiety gnawed at him. The weight of the moment felt heavy, almost suffocating. "Together we can change the narrative," he continued. "We can demand accountability and ensure that no one else has to endure what I faced." The cheers grew louder, and for a moment Marcus felt a rush of hope. But as he scanned the crowd, his gaze landed on a group of protesters at the edge, holding signs that read, "Not all cops are bad," and "Stop the hysteria." His heart sank. It was a reminder that not everyone was on his side. The following days were marked by an escalation in tension. News outlets began to cover the divisive opinions surrounding his story. Social media was flooded with both support and vitriol. Marcus found himself pulled into debates, not just about his experience, but about the very foundation of policing in America. One evening, after scrolling through comments online, he felt overwhelmed. A particularly harsh message stuck with him. "You're just trying to get attention. Stop playing the victim." In the kitchen, Jenna found him staring at his phone, the anger etched on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Just people talking nonsense," Marcus replied, trying to shake it off. "Don't let it get to you," she said, coming to stand beside him. "You're doing something important. Focus on the people who support you, not the haters." "I know, but it's hard," Marcus said, his voice strained. "Every time I think about the progress we're making, I see comments like these and wonder if it's worth it. What if I'm just a target now?" "You're not a target, Marcus. You're a voice. You have the power to make a difference. But that comes with a price," Jenna said softly. He sighed, looking away. What if that price is too high? The tension reached a breaking point when the police department scheduled a press conference to address the ongoing controversy. Marcus learned that Officer Miller would also be present. Despite everything that had happened, he felt a surge of anger at the thought of facing the man who had set this all in motion. "Are you going to go?" Jenna asked as they discussed the event that night. Marcus hesitated. "I don't know. Part of me wants to confront him, to tell him how he made me feel, but another part of me is terrified of what that will bring." "Whatever you decide, I'm with you," Jenna assured him. "But don't shy away from the confrontation if you feel it's important. You deserve to have your voice heard." The day of the press conference arrived, and the auditorium buzzed with reporters, cameras, and the weight of expectation. Marcus stood backstage, heart racing as he prepared to step into the spotlight once more. When he walked out, he spotted Officer Miller sitting among the other officials. The sight of him ignited a fire within Marcus, a mix of anger and the need for resolution. The mayor opened the conference addressing the ongoing issues within the department, but Marcus's focus was solely on Miller. As soon as he was given the floor to speak, he walked up to the podium, determined to confront the man who had caused so much turmoil in his life. "Officer Miller," Marcus began, locking eyes with him, "you have a responsibility to protect the community, yet you chose to see me as a suspect instead of a person. I want to know, what were you thinking that night?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Miller. He shifted uncomfortably, but there was no backing down now. "I was just doing my job," Miller replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your job shouldn't involve racial profiling," Marcus shot back, his voice rising. "You made an assumption based solely on the color of my skin. How does that protect anyone?" The tension in the room was palpable as Miller struggled to respond. Marcus's heart raced, fueled by a mix of anger and desperation for understanding. After the press conference, the media exploded with coverage of the exchange. Social media erupted in outrage, and Marcus found himself both praised and criticized in equal measure. Despite the chaos surrounding him, one thing became clear. He could no longer ignore the impact this was having on his family. The tension was thick at home, and Jenna was increasingly concerned about the emotional toll on Arya. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jenna took a deep breath. "Marcus, I think we need to talk about how this is affecting Arya." He nodded, knowing she was right. "I want to shield her from all this, but it's hard. I can't just turn my back on it either." "We need to find a balance," Jenna said gently. She's starting to pick up on the tension. "It's important for her to know what's going on, but we also need to create a safe space for her." That night, they sat down with Arya and explained, in age-appropriate terms, the issues surrounding racial profiling and why her father was speaking out. It was a delicate conversation, but Marcus could see the understanding in her eyes. "Daddy, are you going to be okay?" Arya asked, her small voice filled with concern. "Yes, sweetie," Marcus replied, pulling her close. "I'm fighting for what's right, and it's important. But we're going to be okay." Jenna watched them, her heart aching from the weight of what they were facing, but also filled with hope for the resilience of their family. The tension in Marcus's life reached a boiling point as the community continued to rally behind him. But with each passing day, the backlash intensified. News cycles turned harsh, and Marcus found himself at the center of a fierce national debate about race and policing. As he prepared for another community event, Marcus stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. His reflection stared back at him, but beneath the surface, he felt the cracks beginning to form. The public support was overwhelming, but the constant scrutiny weighed heavily on him. "Are you ready?" Jenna called from the other room, breaking his concentration. "Just a minute," he replied, forcing a smile. But inside, doubt gnawed at him. What if he was wrong to keep pushing? What if this was all just making things worse for his family? When they arrived at the community center, the atmosphere was electric. Hundreds had gathered to support Marcus, waving signs and chanting for change. It was invigorating, yet terrifying. Standing at the podium, he scanned the crowd, noticing familiar faces from his neighborhood, colleagues from work, and even strangers who had come to show solidarity. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his voice strong but laced with emotion. "This fight isn't just mine. It's for everyone who has faced unjust treatment because of their race. We're standing together to say enough is enough." The crowd erupted in cheers, the energy palpable. Marcus felt a surge of hope as he continued to speak about the need for accountability and reform within the police department. But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was teetering on a precipice. Just as he wrapped up, a voice from the back shouted, "You're just making it worse." The crowd quieted, and all eyes turned to the protester, who held a sign reading, "Stop the hysteria." "Do you really think this is going to solve anything?" the man continued. "You're only dividing us further." Marcus felt his heart race. "This isn't about division. It's about justice," he shot back, the intensity of his voice rising. "It's about ensuring everyone is treated fairly, regardless of their skin color." But as he spoke, doubts crept back in. What if he was only making things worse? In the days that followed, Marcus received an unexpected call from Officer Miller's lawyer, requesting a meeting to discuss the fallout from the public forum. After much deliberation, Marcus agreed, knowing that confronting Miller directly could provide closure or escalate tensions even further. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the police department, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Marcus sat at one end of the table, a knot tightening in his stomach. Officer Miller entered, looking weary and tense. "Thank you for meeting with me," Miller said, his voice lacking its usual bravado. He took a seat opposite Marcus, his hands resting on the table, fingers intertwined. "I'm here to listen," Marcus replied, trying to remain calm despite the emotions swirling within him. "I wanted to apologize," Miller began, his eyes downcast. "I can't take back what happened that night, but I need you to know I'm trying to understand my mistakes." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "What do you mean?" "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Miller admitted. "I realized that my actions were driven by biases I didn't even recognize. I assumed the worst about you because of the color of your skin. That's not who I want to be." The sincerity in Miller's voice caught Marcus off guard. "Why now?" he asked. "Why did it take this long for you to see it?" Miller sighed heavily. "Because it's easier to ignore it when you're on the other side. It's uncomfortable to face, but your story has opened my eyes. I want to change, but I need your help to do it." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Marcus had expected hostility, defensiveness, or perhaps an unwillingness to engage. Instead, he found himself sitting across from a man who was willing to confront his own prejudices. "I appreciate you saying that," Marcus said slowly. "But words mean little without action. If you want to change, you need to do more than apologize. You need to work toward reform in your department." Miller nodded, his expression earnest. "I need to. I'm willing to advocate for racial bias training and community engagement initiatives, but I can't do it alone." Marcus considered Miller's proposal. This could be an opportunity to bridge a gap, to initiate change from within. But the skepticism still lingered in the back of his mind. "Let's work on this together," Marcus said finally. "But I need to see real commitment, actions, not just words." In the following weeks, news of Marcus's meeting with Officer Miller spread, sparking a mixture of reactions from the community. Some praised him for his willingness to engage in dialogue, while others accused him of selling out, claiming that meeting with Miller would undermine his message. At home, the tension began to seep into Marcus's family life. Jenna noticed the strain on Marcus as he juggled the public's expectations and the emotional toll of the ongoing battle. "Are you sure you want to pursue this?" she asked one evening, concern etched on her face. "You're taking on a lot, and I worry about the pressure it puts on you." "I can't walk away now," Marcus replied, his voice firm but weary. "If I do, what message does that send? That I'm afraid? That I'm backing down? This is bigger than me, Jenna. I understand that, but I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself too," Jenna said softly. "You have to be okay for Arya, for us." That night, as Marcus lay in bed beside Jenna, he felt the weight of her words. He had been so focused on the fight for justice that he hadn't fully considered the impact it was having on his family. A major activist rally was planned for the following weekend, with speakers from across the nation gathering to address issues of racial injustice and police reform. Marcus was slated to be one of the main speakers, and the pressure was palpable. As he prepared his speech, he felt both excitement and anxiety. The stakes were higher than ever, and he knew this would be a pivotal moment in his advocacy journey. The rally was expected to attract thousands, and he wanted to ensure his message resonated. The day of the rally arrived, and the energy in the air was electric. The crowd filled the park, holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and "End racial profiling." As Marcus stood backstage, he could hear the chants echoing, a rhythmic heartbeat of determination. When it was time for him to take the stage, Marcus stepped into the light, greeted by a roaring applause. The sight of so many people gathered for a common cause filled him with hope. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady. "Today, we stand united in our fight against injustice. This isn't just about my story, it's about every person who has ever felt the weight of racial profiling and discrimination." The crowd erupted in cheers, fueling his passion. "We must hold our systems accountable. We must demand that our voices are heard. It's time for change." As he spoke, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd, Officer Miller, standing with a group of police officers. The sight made Marcus's heart race. Would this be seen as a betrayal? Would the community accept him standing there, talking about reform alongside an officer? But he pushed those doubts aside. This fight is not just for the victims of racial injustice. It's also for those within the system who are willing to change. We need more officers like Miller who recognize the need for reform. The crowd's response was mixed. Some cheered, others looked unsure. As Marcus continued, he felt the energy shift. This was a moment of potential transformation, and he was determined to harness it. After his speech, the atmosphere shifted. Some community members approached Marcus to express their support, but others confronted him, angry and confused about his association with Officer Miller. "You can't just ignore what he did," one woman shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. "How can you trust him after what happened?" Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their anger. "I understand your feelings, I do, but we have to find a way to move forward. Change isn't easy, and it starts with dialogue." "But he's part of the problem," another voice chimed in. "You're giving him a platform." As the crowd began to murmur, Marcus felt the tension building. He knew this moment could define the next steps in his advocacy, and he had to stand firm. "Trust takes time," he said. his voice raised to cut through the noise. "It takes effort from both sides. If we want to change the narrative, we must engage in the difficult conversations." But as the arguments continued, Marcus felt the frustration rising within him. He had wanted to inspire unity, but instead, he was met with division. Later that evening, as Marcus sat alone in his car, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The voices of dissent echoed in his mind, amplifying his own self-doubt. Had he made a mistake by trying to bridge the gap? Was he losing the support of the very community he was fighting for? As he drove home, his thoughts turned to Jenna and Arya. He needed to focus on what truly mattered: his family, their safety, and their happiness. When he arrived home, he found Jenna waiting for him in the living room, concern etched on her face. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice filled with empathy. "It was intense," Marcus replied, running a hand through his hair. "I thought I could inspire change, but all I did was open old wounds." Jenna moved closer, wrapping her arms around him. "You're doing something incredible, Marcus. Don't lose sight of that. You can't control how everyone reacts, but you can control your message and your actions." As they embraced, Marcus felt the warmth of her support. He realized that despite the turmoil, he was not alone. Together, they would navigate the challenges ahead, no matter how daunting. With each passing day, the tension in Branton City escalated. Marcus received more threats online, and the protesters who opposed him became increasingly vocal. Some called him a sellout for working with Officer Miller, while others argued that he was naive to believe real change could happen. One evening, as Marcus and Jenna prepared dinner, they received a call from an old friend, Tariq, who had been following the events closely. "Marcus, have you seen the latest news?" Tariq asked, his voice tinged with urgency. "No, what happened?" Marcus replied, his heart sinking at the tone. "There's a protest planned for tomorrow, and they're targeting you. They're calling you a traitor for even talking to Miller," Tariq said. "You need to be careful." Jenna looked over at Marcus, her expression turning serious. "We can't let fear dictate our actions. You have to stay strong." "I know," Marcus said, but doubt crept in. "But what if this escalates? What if it puts you and Arya in danger?" "People need to see your courage," Jenna insisted. "You've always stood for what's right. You can't back down now." That night, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in his stomach. He lay awake, thinking about the consequences of his actions, not just for himself, but for his family. The next day, as Marcus approached the community center for the protest, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Hundreds had gathered, some holding signs of support, while others bore messages of anger and dissent. He spotted familiar faces among the crowd, but they were overshadowed by the hostility that filled the air. As he stepped onto the stage, the mixed reactions from the crowd hit him like a wave. Some cheered, others shouted insults. The contrast was jarring, and Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Thank you for being here," he began, trying to steady his voice. "I know that emotions are running high, and this is a complicated issue, but we must engage in honest dialogue if we want to move forward." The crowd reacted, some clapping, others booing. The tension was palpable, and Marcus knew he had to navigate this carefully. "I understand why many of you feel betrayed," he continued, "but change requires unity, not division. We cannot fight against the system if we're divided among ourselves." Just as he began to gain traction with the audience, a loud voice called out, "You're just a puppet for the police." Marcus felt a surge of anger at the accusation, but he fought to maintain his composure. "I'm not here to defend anyone but the community. My goal is to ensure justice for all." "Justice for who?" another protester shouted. "Not for us." As the crowd erupted into chaos, Marcus's heart raced. People were shouting, some pushing against the barriers set up to separate the opposing sides. He scanned the crowd, looking for Jenna and Arya, desperate to ensure their safety. Suddenly, a scuffle broke out at the front of the stage, drawing Marcus's attention. He saw Officer Miller attempting to defuse the situation, but the crowd was growing increasingly agitated. "Everyone, please!" Miller shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the rising tensions. "Get him out of here!" someone yelled, pointing at Miller. Marcus felt a rush of determination. He stepped forward, speaking directly to the crowd. "Listen, Officer Miller is here to listen and learn. We can't have change without understanding. Let's take a step back and talk about this. But the crowd was beyond reason. You're just protecting him. Another voice rang out, and before he knew it, bottles were being thrown toward the stage. Get down, Jenna shouted, pulling Arya close as chaos erupted. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. Marcus saw Miller trying to shield himself from the crowd, and then he felt a surge of anger rise up inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered due to the system. With a sense of purpose, Marcus stepped back to the microphone. Enough, he shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. We're better than this. We need to unite against the real enemy, the systems that allow for this kind of hatred. The crowd quieted momentarily, surprised by his outburst. We can't fight against each other, he continued, breathing heavily. We have to fight for each other. Just then, a protester threw a bottle, hitting the stage, shattering the moment of calm. The crowd surged forward, and in the chaos, Marcus saw Miller step in front of him, trying to shield him from the crowd's rage. Get back, Miller yelled, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude, but also frustration. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. He was fighting for justice. But now, everything seemed to spiral out of control. The protest turned into a melee, with police attempting to disperse the crowd and tensions reaching a breaking point. Marcus found himself swept away from the stage, adrenaline coursing through him as he searched for Jenna and Arya. Jenna, he called out, his voice barely audible over the chaos. He finally spotted her near the edge of the crowd, holding Arya tightly. Relief flooded through him as he rushed to their side. Are you okay? He asked, checking to make sure they were unharmed. But we need to get out of here, Jenna said urgently. This is getting dangerous. They maneuvered through the crowd, which was becoming more chaotic by the second. As they reached the parking lot, Marcus turned to see Officer Miller, still attempting to manage the situation. Stay safe, Marcus, Miller shouted, his voice strained. But Marcus could only shake his head, knowing that the very presence of the police was what had caused this uprising in the first place. They needed change, not confrontation. Once they reached their car, Jenna quickly buckled Arya into her seat, while Marcus kept a watchful eye on the unfolding chaos behind them. The sound of sirens filled the air, and he knew this was far from over. As they arrived home, the reality of the day's events settled in. The news was already reporting on the chaotic protest, and Marcus felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Are you sure you're okay? Jenna asked. Concern etched on her face as they settled in for the night. I don't know, Marcus admitted, his voice low. I thought I could help, but now I feel like I've made things worse. You didn't make things worse, Jenna reassured him. You were trying to unite people. Change takes time and it's not easy. Marcus ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of her words. But what if I can't bring them together? What if it just becomes more divisive? Jenna stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. Then we'll figure it out together. You're not alone in this. You have a whole community behind you. As they stood together, Marcus realized that despite the turmoil outside, he had to keep fighting. His voice mattered, and he needed to be strong for his family and for the community that had rallied around him. That night, as he lay in bed, Marcus made a decision. He would not back down. He would fight for what was right, for the chance to create real change. He thought about Officer Miller and their conversation, the possibility of working together to bridge the gap. In the days that followed, Marcus threw himself into planning the next steps. He reached out to community leaders, activists, and even to Miller's department, seeking opportunities for collaboration. It was time to turn the tide, to focus on tangible solutions instead of simply reacting to chaos. In the days that followed, Marcus began to actively engage with various community groups, activists, and even members of the police department who were open to dialogue. He organized a series of meetings aimed at fostering understanding and cooperation between law enforcement and the community. One evening, Marcus gathered a diverse group at the local community center: activists, police officers, community leaders, and concerned citizens. As they took their seats, Marcus looked around the room, feeling a mix of hope and anxiety. Thank you all for coming, he began, standing at the front of the room. I know that tensions are high and trust is low, but I believe we can start to build a bridge between our communities if we're willing to listen to each other. The atmosphere was charged, but he pressed on. We're all here for a common goal, safety and justice for everyone. Let's share our experiences and perspectives. We have to face the uncomfortable truths together. The discussions were initially heated, with some community members expressing their frustrations about the police's history of racial profiling. Officers present, including Miller, listened intently, taking notes and acknowledging the pain of those speaking. As the night went on, a dialogue began to take shape. Officers shared their own experiences on the force, while community members expressed their fears and frustrations. Marcus facilitated the conversation, ensuring that everyone had a voice. In one particularly emotional moment, an activist named Claire stood up, her voice shaking. I have friends who've been harassed by police for no reason. My brother was stopped just last week, simply for walking home from a friend's house. This is our reality, and it needs to change. Miller raised his hand, his expression earnest. I can't apologize for the actions of every officer, but I can promise to work toward change within our department. I want to understand the impact of our actions and how we can better serve our community. Claire looked at him, her eyes narrowed but curious. What does that mean for you, Officer Miller? It means implementing mandatory bias training, creating community outreach programs, and fostering a relationship of trust, he replied. I want to hear from you, not just when things go wrong, but to build a foundation together. The room is filled with murmurs, a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. Marcus felt a spark of hope. They were beginning to break down barriers. As weeks turned into months, the meetings continued, gradually gaining traction and building momentum. Marcus coordinated workshops and community events, focusing on fostering relationships between the police and the community. One event featured a basketball game between local youth and police officers, aimed at building camaraderie. As Marcus watched the game unfold, he felt a sense of pride. Laughter echoed in the air, and the barriers that had once felt insurmountable were slowly being dismantled. Through these initiatives, trust began to grow. Community members felt heard, and officers were starting to understand the depth of the issues they faced. Miller became an active participant, often joining Marcus in community discussions. The two men, once on opposite sides of a painful encounter, were now allies in the fight for justice. As these changes began to take shape, the media once again turned its attention to Branton City. Reporters started to highlight the positive developments arising from Marcus's efforts and the collaboration between community members and the police. One evening, as Marcus prepared for another community meeting, he received a call from a major news network. They wanted to feature him and Officer Miller in a segment about reforming police practices through community engagement. Are you sure you're ready for this? Jenna asked, concern flashing in her eyes. It's a great opportunity to highlight the changes we're making, Marcus replied. We can show people that progress is possible. As the segment aired, the nation watched as Marcus and Miller spoke candidly about their experiences and the importance of community collaboration. Their genuine dialogue resonated with viewers, sparking conversations across the country about the potential for reform and unity. Despite the positive changes, Marcus still struggled with his emotions. The journey had been grueling, and the weight of responsibility was heavy. One night, after a particularly long day, he found himself sitting on the porch, lost in thought. Jenna joined him, wrapping her arms around him. You've done so much, Marcus. It's okay to take a step back and breathe. I know, he sighed, staring at the stars. But there's still so much work to do. I can't help but worry about what happens next. Focus on the progress, Jenna urged gently. You're not in this alone. Look at how far we've come. He nodded, appreciating her support. I couldn't have done it without you. As the initiatives began to bear fruit, Marcus and the community decided to host a celebration of a day of unity, featuring music, food, and activities that brought everyone together. The day of the event arrived, and the park was filled with laughter and joy. Children ran freely, families mingled, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Marcus felt warmth in his heart as he saw people from different backgrounds coming together in celebration. When it was time for him to speak, Marcus stepped onto the stage, looking out at the crowd. Thank you for being here today. This celebration is a testament to what we can achieve when we work together. Change isn't easy, but we are proving that it's possible. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a surge of hope. This was what he had fought for, a community united in the pursuit of justice and understanding. As the event concluded, Marcus looked around at the smiles and laughter surrounding him. The journey had been long and challenging, but he realized that they had built something special, a foundation for change that could last. Officer Miller approached him, a genuine smile on his face. "Thank you for everything you've done, Marcus. This wouldn't have happened without your courage to speak out." Marcus shook his hand, feeling a sense of camaraderie. "We're just getting started. There's still much more to do, but today is a step in the right direction." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. Together, they opened the door for dialogue and understanding, and now it was up to them to keep moving forward. But as the celebration continued, a question lingered in Marcus's mind. Would this momentum last? Would the changes they had begun to implement survive the inevitable challenges that lay ahead? In the coming days, he would face new obstacles, but he was determined to remain steadfast in his commitment to justice and unity. With the support of his family and community, he believed they could create a lasting impact. As he headed home that night with Jenna and Arya by his side, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were on this journey together, and no matter what lay ahead, they would face it as a family, united in their fight for justice and equality. With the community celebration behind them, Marcus turned his attention to the next steps in the journey toward reform. He organized regular follow-up meetings with both community members and police officers, ensuring that the dialogue continued and that accountability remained a priority. Progress isn't just a one-time event, Marcus reminded the group during one of their meetings. It's an ongoing commitment to change. We have to keep holding each other accountable. During these meetings, community members shared their experiences and concerns, and officers discussed the changes they were implementing in their practices. The discussions were sometimes heated, but Marcus felt that each conversation brought them closer to a deeper understanding. Despite the positive changes, there were still pockets of resistance. Some officers were resistant to the training programs and community outreach initiatives, believing they undermined their authority. Marcus and Miller worked together to address these concerns, presenting data and stories that highlighted the importance of community trust in effective policing. As Marcus immersed himself in this work, he began to notice the toll it was taking on his family life. The late nights, the endless meetings, and the constant pressure to be a voice for change wore him down. He often found himself distracted during family dinners, preoccupied with thoughts of the next meeting or the latest news. One evening, Jenna confronted him after Arya went to bed. "Marcus, you're not here with us. You're physically present, but emotionally, you're miles away." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "I know, Jenna. I just feel like if I don't keep pushing, we'll lose all the progress we've made. But you also need to take care of yourself," she said gently. "You can't pour from an empty cup. We need you here too, fully." Marcus nodded, understanding the truth in her words. He had always been passionate about advocating for justice, but he needed to find a balance that allowed him to be present for his family as well. That weekend, Marcus decided to take a break from his advocacy work. He and Jenna planned a family day, taking Arya to a local museum. As they wandered through the exhibits, Marcus watched his daughter's eyes light up with curiosity and wonder. In that moment, he realized the importance of these small joys, the laughter, the shared experiences, the simple act of being together. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, recognizing that his fight for justice was not just for the community, but also for the future he wanted to build for Arya. As they explored the museum, Marcus found himself engaged in conversations with Jenna and Arya, discussing everything from art to science. For the first time in weeks, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was reminded of what truly mattered: family, connection, and the promise of a brighter future. As Marcus returned to his advocacy work, he was revitalized. He reached out to local organizations, seeking partnerships to further the initiatives they had started. Together, they organized workshops aimed at educating both community members and police officers on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community policing strategies. One workshop featured a panel of community leaders, police officers, and advocates sharing their stories. Marcus served as the moderator, guiding the conversation and ensuring that all voices were heard. "I want this to be a safe space," Marcus announced at the start. "We're here to learn from each other and grow together." The workshop fostered open dialogue, and participants shared personal experiences that illuminated the real impact of policing practices. As the day progressed, Marcus saw barriers begin to break down, with community members and officers laughing and engaging in meaningful conversations. As the workshops continued, the city's leadership began to take notice. The mayor invited Marcus to present the progress they had made to the city council, highlighting the importance of continuing the initiatives. But the moment was bittersweet. During the presentation, an opposing council member spoke out against the efforts, claiming that the city was wasting resources on programs that were unnecessary and divisive. "The police are doing their jobs," he argued. "We don't need to coddle criminals or baby them with programs." Marcus felt the familiar fire rise in him. This isn't about coddling anyone. It's about recognizing the humanity in all of us, officers and community members alike. We cannot ignore the systemic issues that have led us to this point. The council meeting became heated, but Marcus remained resolute. He knew that change was never easy, and he was prepared to stand firm in his convictions. Meanwhile, Officer Miller began to experience the fruits of the training and community engagement firsthand. He found himself interacting more positively with the community, gaining respect from residents who had once viewed him with suspicion. During one community event, Miller was approached by a young black man, Jordan, who had been vocal about his distrust of the police. "Officer, I just wanted to say that I appreciate what you're trying to do," Jordan said hesitantly. "I know it's not easy, but it means a lot to see you here." Miller nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Thank you. I'm learning too. It's important for me to understand your perspective." Jordan smiled, a sign of progress. "If you're serious about change, let's keep talking. I think we can make a difference together." To celebrate the progress they had made, Marcus and the community organized a fair designed to strengthen the bonds between law enforcement and residents. The event featured games, food stalls, and booths for local organizations focused on health, education, and community safety. On the day of the fair, the park was filled with laughter and chatter. Families came out to enjoy the festivities, and for many, it was a welcome respite from the tensions that had previously defined their interactions. As Marcus walked through the fair, he spotted Officer Miller interacting with kids at the police booth, demonstrating safety equipment and sharing smiles. Marcus felt a swell of pride seeing Miller's commitment to building trust within the community. When it was time for Marcus to speak, he took the stage, looking out at the crowd filled with smiles and joy. "Today is a testament to what we can achieve together. We are not just building a safer community, we are building relationships rooted in understanding and respect." The crowd cheered, and as Marcus continued, he felt hope radiating from everyone present. This was what he had fought for, a community coming together. As the sun set on the fair, Marcus reflected on how far they had come. The work wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead. But the progress they had made gave him hope for the future. As he walked home with Jenna and Arya hand in hand, he felt a sense of peace. They had built a community where dialogue was encouraged and understanding was prioritized. "Do you think things will continue to improve?" Arya asked, looking up at her parents with wide eyes. "I believe they will," Marcus replied, kneeling down to meet her gaze. "But it's up to all of us to keep working together." Jenna smiled at her husband, proud of the man he had become. "We'll always be a part of this change, together." In the months that followed, the programs initiated by Marcus and the community grew. Police officers began to participate in local events, forming bonds with residents and fostering trust. The positive relationships developed during these interactions slowly began to reshape the narrative. As Marcus continued to advocate for reform, he found his voice stronger than ever. He was invited to speak at conferences across the nation, sharing his story and encouraging others to pursue similar efforts in their communities. But through it all, he remained grounded in his values, always returning home to Jenna and Arya, always prioritizing family over fame. One evening, sitting on the porch with Jenna, Marcus watched the sunset. He felt a sense of fulfillment as he reflected on their journey. They had faced adversity, but through resilience and collaboration, they had ignited a movement. "Do you think we made a difference?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "Yes," Jenna replied confidently. "You've made a difference not just for our community, but for others as well. This is just the beginning." As they sat together, Marcus knew that the fight for justice and equality would continue, but he was ready for whatever lay ahead. With the support of his family and community, he felt prepared to face any challenge. Together, they would build a legacy of change, ensuring that the next generation would inherit a world where understanding and compassion reigned. As Marcus prepared for another community meeting, he looked around the familiar gathering space, the community center that had become a hub of dialogue and change. He marveled at how much had transformed since that fateful grocery store incident that had set everything in motion. "Dad, are you ready?" Arya, now a teenager, asked as she entered the room. Her energy was infectious, and Marcus smiled at her enthusiasm. "Almost. Just getting my notes together," he replied, glancing at the binder filled with feedback and suggestions from community members. They had been working tirelessly to improve their programs, and Marcus was proud of the progress. As they arrived at the community center, the room buzzed with familiar faces. Officers and residents mingled, discussing their experiences and sharing ideas for further initiatives. It was a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere from just a few years ago. "Look at this," Jenna said, joining Marcus and pointing to a bulletin board filled with photos from various events, workshops, community fairs, and even moments from the police basketball games. "You've built a legacy here." Marcus nodded, feeling a swell of pride. "We've done this together. It's been a community effort." As the meeting began, Marcus took the stage, grateful for the journey that had brought them all together. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, looking out at the diverse crowd. "We've come a long way, and I want to take a moment to reflect on our progress." He shared stories of community members who had stepped up to participate in the dialogues, highlighting the connections forged between officers and residents. "These relationships are what will sustain our efforts long into the future," he emphasized. But as the meeting continued, Marcus felt the excitement building for a special announcement. "I have some news," he said, raising his voice to capture everyone's attention. "We've been invited to share our model at a national conference on community policing in Washington, D.C. This is a chance for us to showcase what we've accomplished together." The room erupted in applause, and Marcus couldn't help but smile. This was a testament to their hard work and commitment. As the date for the conference approached, Marcus felt a sense of urgency to prepare. He coordinated with community members, officers, and advocates, wanting to ensure that their story was told authentically. On the day of the conference, Marcus stood at the podium in a grand hall filled with attendees from across the country. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. He shared the journey of Branton City, detailing how they had transformed their community through collaboration and understanding. "The challenges we faced were daunting," Marcus spoke passionately, "but it was through our collective voices that we found strength. Change doesn't happen in isolation. It requires engagement from everyone involved." As he concluded his presentation, the audience erupted in applause, and he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. It was a powerful reminder that their story had the potential to inspire change beyond their city. A few months later, while at home one evening, Marcus received an unexpected knock at the door. When he opened it, he was met by Officer Miller, who had been an integral part of their journey. "Marcus," Miller said, a serious expression on his face, "I wanted to talk to you about something important." "Sure, come in," Marcus replied, ushering him inside. After they settled at the kitchen table, Miller took a deep breath. "I've been given an opportunity to lead a new community policing initiative in another city. They want to implement what we've developed here in Branton City." "That sounds like a great opportunity," Marcus said, curious about where this conversation was heading. "But I can't do it alone. I'd like you to come with me," Miller said, his eyes earnest. "We can work together to bring the same model of dialogue and trust to other communities. I know how important this work is to you." Marcus felt a mixture of surprise and excitement. "You really think we can make that kind of impact?" "I do," Miller replied. "I've seen what we've accomplished here, and I believe it can work elsewhere too. But it's going to take all of us, community leaders, activists, and officers working side by side. Marcus pondered the opportunity. It would mean leaving Branton City, where he had invested so much of his heart and energy. But the chance to expand their efforts and make a difference in new communities was compelling. That night, as Marcus shared the news with Jenna, he felt a sense of uncertainty. "What do you think?" he asked her, weighing the possibilities. "I think it's a fantastic opportunity," Jenna replied, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "But I also know how much you love this community. You've built something here." "I have," Marcus agreed, thinking of all the progress they had made. "But I also believe in the mission. If we can help other communities, maybe we can create a ripple effect." Jenna smiled, knowing how much this meant to him. "Then I support you, no matter what you choose. Just remember, we're a team." After a few days of contemplation and discussions with the community members, Marcus made his decision. He would take on the new role with Officer Miller, committed to expanding their vision of reform and unity to other cities. Months later, as Marcus settled into his new role, he kept Branton City close to his heart. The lessons learned and the relationships forged there would serve as a foundation for his work. At the new community center, he held workshops, replicating the successful initiatives he had implemented in Branton City. He saw firsthand how the strategies of dialogue and engagement transform communities, breaking down barriers and fostering trust. Through it all, Marcus remained grounded, often reflecting on his journey, from that fateful night at the grocery store to becoming a catalyst for change. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, but he was inspired by the progress made and the lives touched. On a quiet evening, Marcus sat down to write a letter to Arya, now a young woman. He wanted her to understand the importance of their journey and the impact one voice can have. "Dear Arya," he wrote, "the world is full of challenges, but always remember that change begins with you. You have the power to make a difference, to be a voice for those who are silenced. Stand up for what you believe in and never shy away from hard conversations. The journey may be difficult, but it is worth it." As he sealed the letter, Marcus felt a sense of fulfillment. He had fought for justice, unity, and understanding, and he knew that the legacy of change would continue. In the end, it wasn't just about the policies implemented or the reforms made. It was about the connections formed and the hope rekindled in communities. Marcus had learned that the fight for justice was a collective effort, and together they could create a brighter future. As we reflect on Marcus's journey and the transformative power of advocacy, we invite you to be a part of this ongoing conversation. If you believe in the power of unity, understanding, and justice, consider subscribing to our channel. Join us as we continue to share stories of change, promote dialogue, and inspire action. Together, we can amplify our voices and create a lasting impact on our communities. Don't miss out. Subscribe today and be part of the movement for a better tomorrow.